We should have it on the screen as well if you don't have a Bible with you. Jesus said this. He says, you have heard that it was said, eye for what? Eye. You guys are doing better this time. Good. Eye for eye, and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat, in the NIV, as well. Verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, if you're just joining us in this series for the first time, Jesus has been walking through, this is the famous Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus has been walking through several Old Testament laws, and he's been addressing several examples and talking about how do we follow these Old Testament laws as Jesus followers for today. And if you've been with us, you've probably noticed that all of these laws have to do with relationships, how we treat and value other people. Let's just be honest. Relationships are messy. People let us down. They betray us. We've seen this. We've already talked about this so far, looking at these different laws. Humans, we mastered the art of manipulation and twisting words and bending truth and using others to our advantage. And it's easy to stand around a chalkboard here at church. We're in the locker room, right? It's easy to be in our morning devotions with our Bibles open and to come up with this, the best game plan, the best strategy, and craft the perfect plan for loving others. But then we walk out of these doors, we close our Bibles in the morning and we go to work, we go see our family, we see our neighbors, and then it's game time. And suddenly life throws you a punch. Someone insults you. Someone takes advantage of you. They wrong you. And suddenly all those good intentions, your perfect strategy, is put to the test. So what do you do when you experience injustice and mistreatment? Well, notice with me from this passage 3 ways in which Jesus calls us as his followers to treat others when they mistreat us. Look, number 1 is this: reject retaliation. Reject, say that with me, ready? Reject retaliation. Look at verse 38. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Now, this law that Jesus addresses today is a direct quotation from Exodus chapter 21. This is when the law, the 10 Commandments, if you remember, were given just before this, and now he's elaborating on the rest of these laws. This is Moses. In its fuller context, here's what it says. Exodus 21, verse 22. If people are fighting, I love, by the way, that the laws of the Bible, the Old Testament laws, these aren't like imagining this perfect little happy scenario. Like God's like, yeah, I know how y'all act. It's like, okay, you guys are going to fight. Let's not play around. So he says, look, if people are fighting, and this gets interesting, and it says, and hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury. What do we do? It says the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, You are to take life for life. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And he goes on, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So the principle here is if you hurt another person, whether it be on purpose or on accident, as we see in this example, that the punishment should fit the crime. So this phrase that Jesus brings up, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, this was shorthand to signal this law of retaliation, it was often called, and this concept of proportional justice. Now, on surface level, the literal reading of this law may sound harsh. It may even sound vengeful. But it's important to note that Israelites didn't purely interpret this or practice this in a literal sense, but this was usually enforced through financial compensation. In other words, if someone damaged another person's eye, they wouldn't lose their own eye in return, but a value was assigned to the eye. And this is what we see in the example. If someone hurts a pregnant woman, the husband will come up with a price that the court allows as well. They wouldn't go hurt him back or hurt his pregnant wife back, right? They would come up with a price that compares to what was hurt. But why? Because nobody benefits if I break your leg on accident and then you come and break my leg, right? We just have 2 broken legs now. It doesn't help anybody. So even though a literal reading of this text, of this law, sounds harsh, like a license for open vengeance, the intent of this rule was actually the very opposite. In reality, this law wasn't about encouraging retaliation, but it was about limiting retaliation. The purpose was to put a ceiling on vengeance getting out of control. So if you take my eye, I can't take your life. And it's really not hard to imagine the scenario, right? 2 guys are in a brawl and one of them gouges the other's eye out, and then in a literal blind rage, they in their anger, they take that person's life. So this law was addressing, in one sense, overcompensation when trying to get even with somebody. But additionally, it aimed to prevent escalation, right? Think Romeo and Juliet, these family blood feuds that go on for generations and escalate over time, where more and more people continue to get injured and die. So this law was an effort, in a sense, to put a cap on the violence and the bloodshed, so that if someone is injured, if someone is wronged, that they would, the recompense is equal to the wrong, and then we're done. So this law wasn't so much about vengeance, it wasn't about vengeance at all, but it was about just recompense. And this really isn't, when you think about it, this isn't so different than our judicial system today. It seems fair enough, right? You repay the damage you cause with an equal penalty. Seems very American. However, what does Jesus say? How does Jesus say we should apply this Old Testament law today? Look back at verse 38 again. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not, what's the word? Resist an evil person. So the Old Testament law clearly allows for just recompense when harm is done to you. However, Jesus says, when someone wrongs you, do not resist them. Okay, what does this mean? Right away, we need to clarify here what Jesus means, because in English, this phrase, do not resist, it can sound overly passive. As if he's saying that if someone's hurting you, like in an abusive relationship, for example, then you should just be a doormat and do nothing. But this is not what Jesus is teaching here at all. We know this, first of all, because we'll see in just a moment the three examples that Jesus gives to us about this, explaining what he means. We see in these examples that the issue at hand is not physical danger, but it's about insult and humiliation and exploitation. So Jesus is not teaching passive submission to abuse or allowing evil to go unchecked. But it's a shame that this passage is sometimes taught in this way. This is not what Jesus means. We know that from the three examples we'll look at just in a moment, and you'll see why. But secondly, the key to understanding Jesus' teaching here is actually found in a play on words Jesus makes in the Greek language. Now stick with me for a moment, okay? Because this is one of those moments where we have a translation. This is an English translation of the original Greek New Testament. And this is one of those moments where the translation just doesn't, how many of you speak another language? Sometimes when you speak another language, the translation doesn't quite get the meaning across. And we don't catch everything. We don't catch certain puns with words. And so we got to put our nerd hats on for a minute, okay? You guys ready? Put on our nerd hats. We got to dive into the Greek a little bit to see what's going on. You guys ready? With me? Okay. So in the phrases, put up verse 38. In the phrases, eye for eye, see that word for, and tooth for tooth, this English word translated as for is the Greek preposition anti. Okay, following me so far? Not too complicated. The word for is this Greek word anti. And this word anti, this is true with a lot of Greek prepositions, it's translated here as for, but this actually has a wide range of possible meanings. In fact, the word for in our English, it can be used a lot of different ways. It can mean different things when you use the word for in itself, even in our English. And so in this context, put verse 38 up again. In this context, anti means in place of, I in place of, or equivalent to an I. So it's comparing two things that are alike. Tooth for tooth, tooth anti tooth. Okay? Now look at the next verse. Jesus says, but I tell you, do not resist. And this word resist here is the Greek word, it's anti-stemi. Anti-stemi. This is a compound word made up of two parts. One is anti, this is the exact Greek word we saw a minute ago, the stem, that means for, this preposition. And then stemi, this is a word that means to stand, or to stand against something. Maybe we might say today to oppose something. We're looking at something and facing them. Okay, you with me so far? We're getting nerdy. You're with me? Okay. So anti-stemi in our English translates as resist, literally something like to stand against, right? Or we might say to resist, as it's translated in most English Bibles. And at first glance, it looks like, if we just take it, the literal meaning, it looks like it's Jesus is saying, don't stand against evil at all. He says, don't do this. Don't anti-stemi an evil person. But again, when we examine these three examples Jesus gives, they each, again, we're going to look at these in a moment, they each involve a form of resistance. Now, it's a resistance that is bold, that is creative and unexpected. We're going to see that. And because of this, don't miss this, most scholars believe, or I should say many scholars believe, Jesus is using a word play here. And he's drawing on the previous meaning of anti from the verse before, and he's using that meaning when he says antistemi in this verse to mean not simply don't resist, but don't resist in kind. Okay, don't resist equivalent to how you were opposed. So don't oppose someone anti or in the same way they are opposing you, but rather respond in a way that breaks the cycle of retaliation. You guys with me on this? It's getting a little complicated. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, stand in a way that you don't treat them like they're treating you. So he's saying to stand against them, but don't make them the enemy. Here's what Jesus is saying in a nutshell so far. The law says that you are just to seek fair compensation when someone harms you. You have the right to do that. But I say to you, don't oppose them in a way that mirrors how they oppose you. And by doing this, catch this, Jesus shifts the focus from the injury done to us now to the relationship between us and the other person. Instead of you hurt me, so now I'm going to hurt you back, Jesus calls us to respond in a way that values the relationship with the other person. It values relationship over retaliation. By the way, this interpretation of Jesus' words is enforced later by the Apostle Paul. If you go to 1 Corinthians 5, verse 15, Paul paraphrases Jesus, but he changes the verb to something else. Instead of saying, do not resist, Paul writes, do not repay evil for evil. He uses the same for evil, anti, but he changes the verb. He's interpreting Jesus' meaning here to assume that Jesus was not just talking about resistance in general, but standing against someone in the same way that they stand against you. You guys with me on this so far? Okay, so what does this look like practically? Well, this is what Jesus does now for us. He shows us this, giving us 3 examples of what he means. Notice the first one with me in verse 39. Verse 39. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. What does that look like? If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. I know what you're thinking, Pastor Matt, that sounds like exactly the opposite of everything you were just telling us, what Jesus is saying. I know at first glance, this sounds like Jesus is commanding, again, a passive submission that allows a perpetrator to continue to do harm. But the trouble with these, just like the Greek to the English language, all 3 examples we'll see that Jesus gives us here, they just don't translate really well into our cultural context. But in the historical context of this day, what this means is this scenario was anything but passive. First, it's important to note the issue here wasn't physical harm, but public shaming. Notice Jesus specifically says, I know we gotta have our thinking caps on a lot today, okay? Notice Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on which cheek? On the what? On the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek, meaning your left cheek also. And you're saying, okay, what's the big deal? In our culture today, that there isn't, this wouldn't be a big deal, but back in Jesus' day, the right side of the human body versus the left side of the body, this was a big difference. The right side was associated with honor and authority and blessing, while the left side was considered weaker and maybe even impure in some contexts. This is weird to us today, but this is how the ancient reader would have understood. This is how they think when they hear the right hand, the right cheek. So, a slap to the right cheek, think about this. The dominant hand for most people was a right hand. This would have been what? To slap someone's right cheek, this would have been a backhand slap. As one commentator puts it, the backhand blow to the right cheek did not imply shattered teeth. This was an insult. Okay, so this slap, this backhanded slap, though it was not primarily, this wasn't to be physically harmful, but yet it was one of the most severe public insults you can give in this culture. This was an act of, not an act of aggression, but an act of humiliation meant to degrade a person's dignity, to assert dominance, to put someone in their place and to tell them, you are of a lower rank than me. So think about this. Not walking away, but standing your ground and looking them in the eyes of the person who just hit you. And then offering them your other cheek. This isn't doing nothing. This is not passivity. It's resistance, but not resistance in kind. Resistance in kind would be what? It'd be to offer them a backhand right back at them. That's retaliation. But Jesus tells us here that when someone is evil towards you, they publicly shame you or they speak ill of you. He says, respond, but do not respond in kind. In other words, resist retaliation. Now, there's more significance here to this slapping, this first example. We're going to come back to it in a moment if you're a little lost. But Jesus not only calls us to resist retaliation, but number two, to redefine the relationship. To redefine the relationship. Look at verse 40, and then we're going to look at the second example, come back to the first. Verse 40 says this, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Now I know, on the surface, this looks like simply being a doormat. But this is yet another illustration that Jesus uses. It doesn't translate well in our cultural context today. Why? Well, because we have plenty of shirts. We have way too many shirts. How many of you have too many shirts in your closet? We have way too many jackets, and some of you are like, no, I'm a minimalist, Pastor Matt. Or, oh, man, I don't got a lot of money. But listen, compared to Jesus's day, you have a lot of shirts. Why? Because standard wardrobe in Jesus's day meant you likely had two garments. And I don't just mean two that you wear at a time. I mean two that you own. What are they? Well, first was your tunic, as it says in the King James. This is your inner garment. In our NIV, this is your shirt. This is what touches your skin. This is your inner garment. And then you have your inner garment, then you have your outer garment. This is what translates in NIV as your coat. This is thicker. This protects you from the elements. And this is translated as cloak in some other versions. So with that in mind, you have your inner garment, your shirt, your outer garment. Look at verse 40 again. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, it's your inner garment, hand over your coat, your outer garment as well. Notice this is a legal case. Someone is suing you. And in this example, you don't have the money to pay them, and you literally just have your clothes. That's all you own. And this might seem far-fetched to us today, but this was so common of a scenario in Jesus. We have it so well off today. In Jesus' day, this was such a common scenario that there was literally a law about this in the Old Testament. It tells us, according to this law, it says in the Old Testament, it says you can take someone's, in this scenario, you can take someone's outer coat, and you could take it as a pledge for repayment, but you were required to give it back to them before sunset every day. You could literally take it every day in the morning, but you'd have to give it back to them before the sun goes down. Why? Because it says it's their only covering, meaning, and it says, how else will they be able to sleep? In other words, this is like their blanket. I mean, this is someone who owns nothing but their shirt and their coat. And they're sleeping in this coat. This is how they stay warm at night. So notice in this scenario that Jesus, so think about this for a minute. In the scenario Jesus gives us, remember the law says you can take someone's outer coat as pledge for repayment. But in the scenario, what does it say? It says, and someone takes your what? Your shirt. They're taking your, you're dealing with someone here that literally wants to take the shirt off your back. This is really messed up. You follow me on this? So Jesus says, in this evil scenario, you're dealing with this person who wants to humiliate you. They want to harm you. They're literally taking the shirt off your back. What does he say? He says, hand them your coat also. Now think about this. If you only had your inner garment taken, you just had it taken, and now you hand them your outer garment also. What does that mean? It means you're standing there naked. This is what Jesus is saying. He says, you're saying, why in the world would Jesus suggest this? What would be the purpose? Well, you'd certainly be drawing attention to yourself. You would be exposing yourself, but you would also be exposing the injustice being done to you. You see, by taking your inner shirt rather than your outer coat, your accuser can more easily conceal the fact that they are taking anything from you at all. But if you offer them your coat also, then everyone around will see, they will witness the absurdity of this action, exposing just how wrong their actions really are. This is a bold act meant to shock your accuser's conscience into seeing just how wrong their actions are. Again, this isn't doing nothing. This is not passive. It's about refusing to retaliate in kind. It's not responding evil with evil. It's revealing evil instead. Okay, go back with me now to the first example, because we see something similar happening here. Again, turning the other cheek doesn't mean passively accepting another blow. It's an intentional act that forces the other person to see you as an equal. See, to strike someone on the right cheek with your right hand, this is a backhand blow. This was an act of public shame. But to strike someone on the left cheek with your right hand, this was an open palm slap. And I know this is weird in our culture. We're like, these things had big significance. We could compare it to like giving someone the bird, right, with your finger. Like someone 1,000 years from now is going to look back in our history and be like, what's wrong with that finger? Like, this doesn't make any sense, right? This had big significance. To slap someone with your open palm in this culture symbolized striking a social equal rather than an inferior. So a backhanded slap was meant to shame and degrade, but an open-handed slap, it's still an insult, right? This isn't like, oh, we're friends, we're just slapping each other. No, it was an insult, but it was how you would strike someone of equal rank. We don't live in a society of where these different ranks and cultures today that's hard to grasp. But this act of turning the other cheek isn't about submission to that person. No. It's actually about challenging the aggressor's assumptions, forcing them to reevaluate how they see you. In effect, it's saying, why do you feel the need to treat me as lower than yourself and assert power over me? It's a statement that refuses to be defined by their attempt to assign social rank. See, by turning the other cheek, you're not giving up your dignity. You're actually saying, I take back my dignity. It's a declaration that your honor is not determined by how others treat you. And again, listen, this isn't just about our own honor and dignity. The key is, that's part of it, but the key is it's about our relationship with the other person. It's about giving them another chance to see you differently, to act with integrity, and to restore the possibility of living in peace and mutual respect. One of the most powerful modern examples I can think of this is the Selma, Alabama March of 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement. As marchers peacefully crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met with brutal force. They were beaten with clubs, trampled by horses, choked with tear gas. But as they were both physically harmed and publicly humiliated, they didn't walk away. But neither did they fight back. Instead, they stood their ground. They kept moving forward, refusing to retaliate. And the sheer injustice of the scene, armed officers attacking unarmed men and women not fighting back, this exposed the cruelty of the system for what it was. Their nonviolent resistance didn't just challenge oppression, but it put the oppressor's unjust actions on full display for the world to see. They were standing there naked, coat in hand, not in defeat, but in defiance, forcing the world to see their oppression and injustice for what it truly was. And the beautiful part about this creative, non-violent resistance that Jesus teaches is it doesn't just challenge the oppressor. Catch this. It offers them a way out too. See, the goal here isn't humiliation or revenge, as that would be responding in kind, evil for evil. The goal is a restored relationship. The goal is a relationship restored with the other person, built on mutual respect. So step one, see, is it's naming and exposing what's wrong. But step two is moving forward. It's moving toward the offender in a bid for a different kind of relationship. To borrow from Martin Luther King Jr.'s 10 Commandments to Nonviolence, this was the pledge that his followers, those in this movement, all had to sign. And commandment number 5 states this: sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Not just so we can be free, not just the oppressed, but even those who oppress can be free. then listen to the radical countercultural words of commandment number 2 that I think reflects the heart of Jesus here. Here's commandment number 2 in this. He says, remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. In other words, this isn't about defeating an enemy, but about transforming hearts and relationships by breaking cycles of oppression through love and truth. Because turning the other cheek and giving up also your coat isn't just to reveal the wrong, but to redefine the relationship. But Jesus gives us a third way to respond to mistreatment, and that is to respond with generosity. Respond with generosity. Look at verse 41 again. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow. As I mentioned, all 3 of these examples Jesus gives, it doesn't translate into our modern culture. So when Jesus says this, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, he's not talking about your fitness tracker guilt-tripping you for missing your step goal for the day. Thought I'd get a laugh there, no? Okay. You guys with me this morning? Okay. Work on my jokes. What's happening here? The Jews during Jesus' day, they were a subjugated people under the rule of the Romans. According to Roman law, soldiers had the right to force imperial subjects to carry their gear at any time they wished, but only for 1 mile. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know when the last time you walked a mile. I think Disney World every year is about whenever we go, it's about the only time I walk more than to the kitchen and my bedroom. We don't walk much anymore, do we? He says, if anyone forced you to walk a mile, but not only that, it says, imagine then having to walk a mile carrying 60 to 100 pounds of gear. Suffice it to say, this was not a leisurely stroll in the park. Imagine going about your day and you're working in your field, you're attending to your family, and suddenly a Roman soldier interrupts and orders you to carry his gear, to drop everything and come with him for a mile, and then you have to travel back to wherever you were, pick up what you were doing in the middle of your workday. You had no choice. Refusing could result in a beating, imprisonment, or worse. And it wasn't just the physical burden that made this so difficult, but imagine just the sheer humiliation of this, being treated like a pack mule for a foreign oppressor. Every time a Jew was asked to carry a soldier's gear, it was a brutal and shameful reminder that they were not free. So I think it's safe to say this was not one of the Jews' favorite Roman laws. With that in mind, look again at verse 41. Jesus said, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. In other words, don't just do the bare minimum required by the law, but respond to their undeserved hostility with undeserved hospitality. Now, let's be honest. This is pretty radical. Like, this isn't helping your best friend move their couch on a Saturday morning and grabbing Waffle House after. This is going the extra mile, means treating someone who takes advantage of you, someone who inconveniences you, and someone who publicly humiliates you, and treating them like your best friend. Think about it. When you have to move, when it's time, you need to move your house and you're packing up all your stuff, who do you call? Well, unless you're paying movers, you call your very closest friends. You call your family members, those who you know truly care about you and are willing to sacrifice their time and energy for you. Well, in the same way, carrying a soldier's gear for a mile, this was like helping someone move. This was something you wouldn't just do for somebody else freely, unless they were a really close friend. So why does Jesus ask us to treat our bitter foes like best friends? The answer? Because they're not our enemy. And not only are they not our opponent, but they are our objective. See, that person who mistreats you, they're a creation of our God, just like you and me. They're a person whom God created in his image. They're a person that Jesus values so much that Jesus gave up his own life to die for on the cross. And they're a person that is pursued by a God who longs to save them. What does that mean for us? That means that we ought to pursue them in love and long for their salvation too. And listen, they can treat you like a pack mule for 1 mile. But as soon as that mile's over, you now have an opportunity to redefine your relationship with them through radical generosity. Not only might this transform their relationship with you, that's important, that's good, but the goal is that it lead to transforming their relationship with God. Because isn't this exactly how Jesus transforms us through the cross? See, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were driving the very nails into his hands and feet on the cross, Jesus said, "Father, curse them." No. He said, "Father, forgive them." And now Jesus calls us as his hands and feet on earth today to reflect this radical generosity to others, even those who mistreat us. We don't often talk about this aspect of being the hands and feet of Jesus on earth. That it's not always serving those who thank us or treat us kindly. After all, the hands and feet of Jesus had nails pierced into them on the cross. This means that sometimes being the hands and feet of Jesus on earth involve embracing suffering and sacrifice required to love those who wrong us. Now again, Jesus is not suggesting this in the same context for someone who has been repeatedly victimized by an abuser. It's not what he's talking about here. The point is this. Here's the question. How can we respond when we suffer injustice in a way that reflects both God's justice and God's generosity? How can we expose injustice while still offering a chance for real transformation through the means of radical generosity? This is the way of the gospel. Now, the scenarios we face today will look different than these 3 examples. Maybe it's a coworker taking credit for your work. Maybe it's a neighbor consistently disrespecting your boundaries. Maybe it's a friend who betrays your trust, or someone who constantly cuts you off in conversation or disregards your opinions. And in each of these situations, the question to ask is this: how do I respond in a way that doesn't just defend ourselves, but creates space for grace to work in the other's heart? How can we give the other person an opportunity to think better of you, and most importantly, to think better of Jesus? Through emulating Jesus' radical hospitality. Jesus is trying to teach us here that violent resistance will never solve our deepest, most entrenched problems in the human story, but that only generosity can. See, the world says, you hit me, you hurt me, so I'm going to get you back. But the Christian is called to think, you hurt me because you're carrying your own pain. So how can I be the hands and feet of Jesus to you, offering grace and generosity in a way that might bring healing and transformation to your heart, just like Jesus did for me? Whereas Jesus said in verse 42, give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This is all much easier said than done, isn't it? Then in the heat of the moment, someone punches you square in the mouth. But by the very grace, the very power of God's grace to us, Jesus tells us we too may be empowered through the Holy Spirit to respond with grace to others, even when it's the very last thing we feel like doing. To end with one more powerful quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And listen, here's how he finished. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. This is the radical generosity Jesus calls us to. As we enter into a time of prayer and response, let's pray that God would give us this strength to respond to those who mistreat us with generosity and grace. Would you pray with me? Lord Jesus, we need your grace badly. Would you help us in this area, Lord? Would you help us to see others not as our opponents, not as our enemies, but as someone who you loved and died for, and help us to die to ourselves like you did, like you sacrificed yourself for us, Lord, so we might see a relationship transform, not just with us, but with you. We ask this and pray in your holy name, Jesus. Amen.